All right, I think we can get started with session 2. So hi everyone again, and welcome back, and welcome to session 2 of our webinar on aligning Canadian electricity systems with net zero. I know we have some new participants tuning in for the second session. So for those folks, my name is Anna Canduce. I'm with the Canadian Climate Institute, joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I don't think I'll do another full overview of the Institute's electricity project, as I believe most of you were here for the first session, but I'll ask Christiana to drop the link to the project website into the chat again, as well as the link to our second scoping paper, Waves of Change, which we're going to turn to now. Thanks, Christiana. So as I mentioned in the first session, the purpose of these scoping papers is to generate new thinking and useful insights to support and inform our work, but also broader policy discussions. And as is the case for this paper, they can also provide a different perspective and viewpoint on a given issue. And when it came to the scoping paper on Indigenous participation and leadership in the transition, we couldn't think of a better organization to write it than Indigenous Clean Energy, a leading organization advancing Indigenous inclusion in Canada's clean energy future. And I really encourage anyone on the line who isn't familiar with their great work to check them out. Maybe Christiana, you can drop a link to ICE's website as well. So this scoping paper that was commissioned by the Climate Institute and authored by Indigenous Clean Energy is part of a broader initiative at the Institute to amplify Indigenous voices, research, and worldviews to ensure that our research and also broader climate policy is more meaningfully including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives. So as part of this initiative, we've also commissioned a series of Indigenous essays and case studies, which you can read on our website. But I think that's enough from me. I'd like to now welcome 3 of our partners from Indigenous Clean Energy who are here to share their perspectives, insights, and experiences on this important topic of catalyzing Indigenous leadership in Canada's clean electric future. I see they've all joined us on the screen. So we're joined by Tana Peary-Wilson, board member at Indigenous Clean Energy and former CEO of band operations for Tobique First Nations. Daryl Brown, president of Kisik Clean Energy and Kisik Commercial Furniture and chair of the board at Indigenous Clean Energy, and Chris Henderson, executive director of Indigenous Clean Energy. So welcome everyone, and thanks again for being here today. But also thank you for your contributions to our project through this wonderful scoping paper. And before I do get into my questions for you, I want to signal again to people on the line, if you're new to the call, that we are going to have an opportunity at the end of the call for questions from the audience. So if you do have questions for Daryl, Tana, and Chris throughout the conversation, you can feel free to drop them in the chat, and then Christiana is going to collect those and pose a couple to the panelists at the end of the call. So let's get into it. Chris, maybe I'll start with you. So for folks who haven't had a chance yet to read Waves of Change, could you give us a 1 to 2 minute overview of the objective of the paper and also some of its key themes?
Sure, Anna, it's my privilege to join you from the traditional ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa. Waves of Change is a story. It's a story of the last 2 decades of Indigenous clean energy leadership, and looking forward to the next decade of Indigenous clean energy leadership. And that's why we've called it Waves of Change. It describes the first 3 waves, much as waves come on the ocean as we border the 3 oceans, great oceans of the world, the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Atlantic, where the Indigenous communities live and have lived for centuries. And Waves of Change talks about what's happened in the first 3 waves, but talks about the juncture point where we are now and the 4th wave. And the 3 key things I would highlight in the themes of the Waves of Change scoping paper is, first of all, it is an expression of Indigenous voices on clean energy, a collective expression of Indigenous leadership. Secondly, Waves of Change identifies that the next wave, what we call the 4th wave, is going to be much more diversified. Where the first 3 waves are mostly renewable energy, the next wave is going to be dealing with heating and cooling and infrastructure, advanced energy systems, and green energy infrastructure. And the third major theme of Waves of Change is to identify all those opportunities that are very specific, that require Indigenous leadership to move forward on, and highlights a range of policy, fiscal, and strategic measures so those can be catalyzed. That's what we start to do with the Waves of Change paper, Anna.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that excellent overview. I think the paper does a really great job of mapping out, as you're saying, that evolution of Indigenous leadership and participation in Canada's low carbon transition, and also provides some really great examples along the way. But I'd like to turn to Tana and Daryl to hear about, your firsthand experience of getting some of those projects off the ground. So maybe we can start with you, Tana.
Okay, thank you. I'm zooming in from the traditional territory of my people, the Wolastoqiyik, and that's the people of the Bountiful and Beautiful River, and it's Tobic First Nation. We have a 20 megawatt wind project and a 30-year power purchase agreement with the utility. It didn't come without obstacles and those crashing waves, as Chris has mentioned. It was about an 11-year process, starting back when the blueprint for green energy had come out in 2011. We partnered up with a company, Natural Forces, in 2014, and we were getting ready for a wind farm project. And it so happened the New Brunswick government had rolled out in 2015 the LORES program, which is a locally owned renewable energy small scale project. So where they did 20 megawatts set aside for Indigenous communities, and then another 20 megawatts were set aside for partnerships or municipalities. We entered into the first round expression of interest, and we didn't get very far, even though our project was shovel ready. So that was kind of disheartening to our chief and council and the community after putting that much engagement work and upfront work in to ask our community to invest in a major infrastructure project like that. So it was without ado. I remember the Friday, I lobbied all 15 chiefs and lobbied my MPs and said, okay, we're not happy with this. So with the help of those other chiefs, we were able to push the Wajousin Wind Energy Project, and we were successful in the second round of the EOI, so the expression of interest. So to get a community's hopes up like that, and then to have them crash back down, that was something that was a bit disheartening. But in the end, now we have a beautiful project in the Sussex East region that produces energy to over 5,000 homes here in New Brunswick, and that to me is success. And I'd like to hand it over to Daryl to talk about his project.
Thank you, Tana. Anine, Tanzi, I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg. We just want to note that our hydroelectric power comes from the backs of our Treaty 5 cousins here in Manitoba, who have lost a lot of their land. Our water comes from Shoal Lake First Nation, who was cut off for the last 40 years when the aqueducts were built. So I just want to acknowledge that. The projects that I've been involved with, the first one was Gull Bay First Nation in Northwestern Ontario. And the way it got started was the Crown Utility showed up with a pot of money to kickstart the project. And it was based on reconciliation due to flooding that the community had suffered again when they built these hydroelectric dams in their area. So that was how the project got kickstarted. And from there, we were engaged by Chief and Council to come on board as advisors. For the project that I'm currently on, which is in action right now, in play, for Northern Manitoba, Saisi Dene First Nation, we just started organically. Was a chief and I sitting down and talking about, this is what happened over in Gull Bay. Do you want to do something similar? So we scrounged and we found little pots of money. We got the momentum started. We were able to get enough money to engage our engineering firm for the feasibility study. So that was how we got started in this. We're in the very early stages of that project, but Gull Bay First Nation is well documented. I think there's 7 or 8 videos online of it, if anyone wants to take a look. but you're going to be seeing a really interesting story when we get done with Dene here in northern Manitoba, and that's a few years out from now.
Thanks so much, Tana and Daryl, for sharing your experiences and your successes in getting those projects off the ground. Looking ahead, I think, Chris, you already touched on this a little bit, but, as you mentioned, the paper refers to this fourth wave of change. Interested to hear you folks talk a bit more about, some of the key opportunities you see for Indigenous leadership and participation, moving forward with the transition. So maybe, Chris, we can start with you and then hear from Daryl and Tana as well.
Thanks, Anna. One of the things you'll see in the paper is a medicine wheel. It's a spectrum of Indigenous clean energy opportunity rooted in Indigenous culture. And it goes well beyond renewable energy into energy efficiency and conservation of Indigenous homes, and also with advanced energy and newer technologies. And some of the things we point to specifically are these. One is that about 60% of the baseload of Canada's electricity is hydro. But many of those hydro facilities have to be refurbished or rebuilt, like the Mactaquac Dam on the St. John River in New Brunswick. That'll cost $3 billion to do. Many of those facilities were not built with Indigenous consent. They also had major impacts. We think that we need to re-strengthen our hydro facilities, but also then integrate it with renewable energy that Indigenous communities would like to develop and build. So we think that what we have to do is really move to a more integrated approach on clean energy, not just have rifle shots of one project to another, but a more systemic change on it, building on our hydro base, but then also unlocking the market of Indigenous communities being able to directly develop renewable energy, for example, and sell it to industrial or institutional customers, like a hospital or university. We need to democratize the process of energy as we move forward. And I'll let Daryl talk further on the reduction of diesel, because it's a major area of opportunity in remote communities. But we also really need to reduce energy demand. And we need to do that by recognizing that Indigenous housing across the country is substandard, but it can be much a better asset, but a more livable homes if we do them with the right energy systems that reduce the need for energy, but also utilize technologies like heat pumps and high efficiency wood stoves to make them healthier, so that you get greater benefits than just clean energy itself. So we've identified in the Waves Apart report the innovation that we need to occur. And I would be remiss in not saying a key part of this innovation is inclusion. Inclusion of more women employed in the clean energy sector. And we're absolutely totally proud that almost 40% of the participants in our programs and a majority of our staff in Indigenous clean energy are women. But we also think the programming for young Indigenous people coming out of colleges and universities being prepped to move into the clean energy sector as careers is key. And that's why programs like we have, like Generation Power and Imagination, are so important. So we think there are great opportunities, but we'll come back to what needs to happen next. But I'll turn to my dear friends, Daryl and Tana, for their viewpoints.
Thanks, Chris. Over to you, Daryl.
Thank you. So I just wanted, I should clarify, Chris reminded me that the two projects I just spoke of are off-grid First Nation communities that are still on diesel. And so that's what we did was we in the case of Gull Bay, integrated renewable energy. So their reduction in diesel was significant. And we'll be doing the same thing with here in northern Manitoba. But I think the opportunity for First Nations is to become energy producers, to own their own assets, to become revenue generating power producers, and also to recognize that they're owed this, and it's part of their sovereignty. It's also a good stream for lifting the community up in their out of their grinding poverty, which a lot of our First Nations, especially the ones that are off grid, are in presently.
Thanks, Daryl. Over to you, Tana.
I think that now's the time more than ever for key Indigenous leaders to step up. I know that it's happening. It's starting. When we started this in 2016, and even before that, there was little talk at the chief and council level, at that level, around climate action, climate change, and even energy sovereignty. In my own community, we had the grandmothers actually take over our local hydro dam back in 2009, following when one of the oldest elders, who was a World War II vet, had his power cut off. And we're less than a kilometer away from a hydro dam, and an elder had his power cut off. So that's that path of forward for our community to take back our energy sovereignty. And we saw fit that obviously we couldn't do that without the collaboration and getting into talks with the utility, the local municipality, and then looking at what are my community's options. Like how can we right this wrong? This was put in the back of our backyards, and here we have people being cut off power. So that led down to the path where we signed an MOU with the utility to bridge that gap, and we've been doing it so ever since. Out came the Wajousin Energy Project that has brought, economic value and economic dividends back to the community that weren't once there before. And those are being reinvested into those areas that my brother Daryl has spoke of, the impoverishment of our social networks of housing, putting it towards our youth, our elders. Our elders, many people don't know this, but because of our transient lifestyles, they don't have adequate pensions. So to get them to that economic level, we're having to use and dip into own source revenues to fulfill these gaps that a lot of the social policies in Canada aren't fulfilling the needs of our community members. So now more than ever that our leadership is taken over onto and paving this path for the next generations. And I think it's actually the younger generations, the ones that I'm mentoring, they're the ones that are starting to demand this of leadership. So I think it's a great time that we're having this conversation and moving this needle forward.
Thanks so much, Tana. The words that you and Daryl are sharing are just kind of emphasizing the need to catalyze Indigenous leadership and the importance of having Indigenous folks leading these projects in their communities. So thank you. You've already touched on this a bit, Tana, but I want to read a quote from the scoping paper. It reads that the bottom line is that new relationships must be forged now to create a clean electricity future. I'm wondering if you folks can speak a bit about, how the relationships between Indigenous communities and other actors in the electricity system need to evolve. You spoke a bit about utilities, but also with developers, with system planners, with governments. Why don't we start with you, Tana, and then we'll go over to Daryl and Chris.
That relationship has to start with self too. One of the things that I noticed is that we get all happy at a meeting, but then afterwards, who's doing the real work after? Rate education about who we are as Indigenous people and what our resilience. The first panelists, they talked about resiliency, and all I could think about was my grandmothers and my uncles and my aunts, these people who have shown time and time and time again their resilience to live in the conditions that we've been forced into. So that relationship, and recognizing that it is a relationship that needs to be rebuilt, recognizing that it's a relationship that it's going to take a time, and it's happening, but it's going to take time, it's going to take patience, and recognizing that at all levels that, my brother Daryl said it's something that it's owed to us. We deserve a seat at that table. We deserve a seat at that conversation. We deserve a seat at that regulatory top. Why aren't there more Indigenous regulators? Why aren't there more Indigenous people in the procurement strategy? Why aren't we mentoring them into that? So why aren't we opening those doors up and making it a lot more easier for people like myself or Daryl to get into it? And that's I believe that's what this Catalyst program has done for me. It's given me the courage and the voice that I didn't have 5 years ago to speak up about that relationship. That relationship is hard when you go back to the table with the utility, when you go back to the table with the province. You spoke about it, Anna, and I think it was the previous panelist that mentioned that there's these roles and responsibilities that have to be really hashed out. Well, in our communities, we really understand what our roles are. We've been taught that from generation to generation, and it's getting those other systems and those other people to understand that we have these roles within our community, and we even have that role within nature, within Mother Earth, within the environment. So
Thanks,
we
Tana.
need to.
Daryl, over to you.
Well, thank you. I just think that there has to be an equal understanding, an equal footing between the First Nation and the government and the Crown utility, for example, that probably exists, or it could be a private company. There should be that level of respect, and that's what we tried to do when we initiated each of those projects I mentioned, is try to reach the ministers and then federal and provincial, and then start going into the utilities and to senior management CEOs and introduce them. And you know, we also need representation, like Tana said, in management and in Indigenous relations. We can't have that handed to us. We need to be part of that. So it's very important for, I'll just use Manitoba Hydro, for example, their Indigenous Relations Department to really extend a welcome hand when we're entering into an own power generation for one of the off-grid First Nations. And it's happening slowly but surely. So I'm hopeful for the future, but there's a lot of, you know, it's an overused word, but I'll say it again, reconciliation that has to happen here. And part of that is to have the respect for that community. Just give you a quick example. We just canceled the 3rd charter into the First Nation in Northern Manitoba because that's the way the community operates. If there's a death, if there's, you know, literally members being flown back for funeral services and things like that, you can't have industry going in there for geotech and things like that. So understanding the relationship is also understanding who you're dealing with, and that's important too.
Thank you, Daryl. Chris, anything to add to Daryl and Tana's great comments?
Well, to my sister Tana and my brother Daryl, I would say that we all recognize that Canada is a colonial enterprise, and so is the power system of Canada a colonial enterprise. If we're going to realize a net zero future, that is just in terms of the recognition of Indigenous rights, treaties, and territory, we have to change. I'll quote something from the Waves of Change paper to add to yours, Anna, and it goes like this. There's just no way to say this diplomatically. Much electricity planning across Canada is flawed, and planning for a clean electricity future is fragmented, characterized by a lack of intention. So if we're going to get to a better future, one that is more economically, socially, and environmentally abundant, we're going to have to change the way we do things. So what we've spoken about in Waves of Change and what we advocate for in Indigenous clean energy is, as Tana and Daryl have described, clear Indigenous and local participation in how we plan electricity futures and projects, where the seats at the table are equal and fair. It's not done by fiat, by governments and utilities. That's the old approach. That's the colonial approach. And what we need to do, therefore, is recognizing that relationship is the profound basis of change. It's the foundation of trust. And if we do that, then we start planning differently. We start looking at those futures that are more integrated and creates a range of opportunities that we believe that are not only going to be better for an electricity system, but will also be better in terms of a climate future. And so that's what we've articulated with some degree of detail in the Waves of Change paper. And we at Indigenous Clean Energy will obviously love to respond to people who have other insights and thoughts.
Thanks so much, Chris. So in the paper, you also highlighted, and Tana, you've already spoken to this too a bit, but the importance of supporting clean energy careers and entrepreneurship for Indigenous youth and young adults. So especially for Daryl and Tana, but also would love to hear from Chris, for Tana and Daryl as catalysts as graduates of the 2020 program, how important has that education and training, been for you in catalyzing your own Indigenous leadership in the transition? And also interested to hear, what other ways are there to support Indigenous entrepreneurship and leadership? So maybe we can start with you, Daryl.
Sure. So we were the first group of cohorts to go through the Catalyst program. 2020 Catalyst program is part of the Indigenous Clean Energy offering. And, it really taught us how to execute, how to begin, execute, finance, and conclude our renewable energy projects for our communities. That was the basis of the training. It was a summer-long intensive training, and it really surrounded us with business mentors, with First Nation mentors and coaches, and it really was a really effective way for us to be immersed in what we need to do. By the time we finished our studies, we knew what had to be done for us to go back to our territories or and then to execute those projects, whether we were working for one of our local First Nations or working for our own community. And so, and it could be a territory or, Nunavut as well. What we really thought about the 2020 Catalyst program was that each cohort bonded together like you wouldn't believe. Tana and I and all our cohorts, we feed off each other when we're executing our projects. We ask each other, what do you think of this barrier that I just hit? Oh, well, I had that barrier and this is how I got around it, or this is what we did and who we called in. So we play off each other, we learn from each other, and we've been doing it for 7 years, I believe it is, and meeting each year's graduate and helping them, and to the point where now I guess we're getting up there, Tana, that we're becoming mentors ourselves for the younger generation, and that's another program within the ICE network. And I'll just throw it over to my sister.
Thank you. Like I mentioned just before, I don't know where I would be without it. I think that all those hurdles that we had run into with Wajausen, with the following wind farm project, the other virtual wind farm project that our community went into, without the strong network that the Catalyst program actually developed for us, and the one-on-one mentorship and leadership, and the creating of that family, that social fabric, that I wasn't afraid to make mistakes. I wasn't afraid to go to the regulator and challenge some of those legislations. I wasn't afraid to forge forward, knowing that I had a network of people who believed in what I believed in. And that's what the Catalyst program did for me, is give me that solid foundation of wisdom. I mean, there was so much wisdom shared, collective, that was transmitted amongst all of us, and that's like hundreds of years of knowledge that goes through. So that creates a type of energy in itself. When we first started, and we didn't know where this was going to go, we didn't know that we were going to be where we are today. We just knew we had something. That first cohort, we knew that there was something magical about what Chris was created and had created for us, and the fact that he's saying, okay, you guys lead it now. You guys are the leaders. You tell me. And to have that someone to believe in you, and to understand what our core values and our beliefs are, and to bring those into our projects, and to do it in such a way that industry and utility and government understood, that to me is worth more than what revenues I'm getting back from our wind farm.
For sure.
Anna, if I could build on what Daryl and Tana said, I want to acknowledge that the programming within 2020 is for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And that programming and that whole program is really the leadership of my dear friend and colleague, Aaron Stewart, assisted by myself and Terlyn Morrison and Ian Skelton and others. And it's really become a peer learning program, as Daryl's noted, where most of our faculty in the first few years were not Indigenous. Now they are mostly Indigenous. And we've really created this peer learning that's forging it. And so, I mean, in waves of change, we identify some of the issues that are unique to Inuit communities in terms of, for example, off-grid diesel reduction and energy efficiency. But through the whole program of 2020 Catalyst, it's evolving to be much broader and impactful. And I got to tell you, the people who designed this program and run it in fair measure, they're the real champions. And I so appreciate my brother and my sister talking that way.
Thank you all for your wonderful answers. I have one more question before we turn to a couple audience questions, and it's maybe a big one to end on, and I know we're short on time, but I'd be interested to hear from all of you, maybe with one idea, what other changes would you like to see from governments to support this fourth wave of Indigenous leadership?
Perhaps I could kick off, Anna. I really think we have to recognize that provincial and territorial governments are the leads here, very much as Daryl noted in Manitoba. And too often with these national initiatives, we talk about it as a national issue. No, we have to recognizing that Yukon is different than BC, that's different from New Brunswick, which is different from Quebec. And we have to engage with provincial and territorial governments and their interests and the utilities, both private and Crown, in terms of that change process. So I really think the heart of this change is that engagement, but there's a very important federal role to recognizing that the fiscal transition to a net zero future will require a major investment that I do think is a partly federal role. But I think the real key here is that we need to work on a different set of relationships with provincial, territorial governments, regulators and utilities, and Indigenous communities and peoples. That's the playing field we've got to play on.
Thanks, Chris. Over to Daryl or Tana.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think I agree with everything that's been said. The most important thing is that the federal government does have a role in that. They can give us support, give us some capacity building money, which is exactly what they did with my Northern Manitoba project. And that money allowed us to start negotiations with the utility. And without that, we don't have a chance to get our momentum and our project off the ground. So you've got to develop your feasibility and your modeling for the renewable energy, but you've also got to engage the utility at the same time. And that takes some expertise. It takes a lot of education, a lot of community engagement with your clients. So the farther they are away, the more it costs, right? To engage with them, especially in person, if that's possible. And so we appreciate the federal government's support in the particular project that I'm referring to right now. But then you go back to the provincial and here in Manitoba, we just need the masters, the political masters, to understand that you need to tell your utility to open up to these First Nations. They can't afford the rate hikes that are coming. They can't, and that's why they're all scrambling. Even the on-grid First Nations here are looking to solar to offset their monthly payments for those rates, those utility rates. So it's important to understand that, allow them the chance, keep the door open, and be open to them becoming energy producers, asset owners, and revenue producers, and it'll be good for everybody, good for our entire economy, both locally and nationally.
Thanks, Daryl. Final word to you, Tana, before we turn to the audience.
It's just Indigenous inclusion at all levels. At the utility level, at the municipality level, when that grid is going through, when the transmission lines are going up, at every level, Indigenous inclusion. And my brother Daryl's right in saying that the feds and the province themselves can step to the plate and provide those additional resources for that capacity development at the leadership level, at the local level, at those young mentorship levels, post-secondary students who are just coming out of university trying to find their path like this. There's so many options that are available to us that we can put this information and open the door. Like Daryl said, keep those doors open, have that seat. We have this thing in my culture where we always have one chair that's open, and that chair is for spirit. So now I'm asking governments and industries to have 2 seats at that table, one for spirit and Indigenous inclusion.
Thank you, Tana. So I think we'll turn now to Christiana, who's been in the chat collecting questions. I think we probably have time for one, maybe two. So over to you, Christiana.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the panelists so much for chatting with us today and speaking about your experiences. There was a lot of comments in the chat saying how powerful your stories are. So I think we're really inspired and we really love hearing from you. One question that did come up was about northern communities. And if you had any recommendations specific to northern and remote communities on how we can support Indigenous clean energy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know a couple of things. With Indigenous clean energy, we used to have some very active programming for northern and remote communities with Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative, which in fact NRCan supports. And what we would say there, the heart of that is doing comprehensive community energy planning. Because in fact, if you can do energy efficiency with better housing and reduce energy demand, that's probably the most effective, and in fact, it is the most effective economic way and health way to reduce energy requirements. But we do think that we do that programming that leads to better opportunities for Indigenous communities to develop capacity to both improve energy consumption and generate new forms of energy supply. You look at communities like Old Crow in the Yukon and Fort Chip in Alberta that have been diesel communities that have developed major solar projects with storage to replace diesel, and along with energy efficiency and a comprehensive community energy planning and community engagement and involvement is key. Those are things that we think need to be offered. We mentioned them in Waves of Change in the paper, but you can see tons more on our website and information. And I'd be remiss if I wouldn't say to people, join the ICE network, which is icenet.work. Don't go to ice.network. That's a figure skating site. That's not us. But if you go to icenet.work, you'll see all kinds of resources. It's free of charge, where people like off-grid northern communities and Inuit communities can tap into resources for change.
Thanks, Chris. Over to Daryl and Tana with any additional comments.
Yeah, this might be drilling down too far, but I just want to note something. Each time that I've been involved in negotiations with the utility, they've turned around and said, well, it's going to cost you probably 6 figures for us, the utility, to look into your interconnection of your renewable energy, your First Nation renewable energy into our system. And I've often thought that's not right. There is a powerful, strong revenue generating utility charging the First Nation just to have a look at how we can work together. Like those kinds of things need to change. And I'm just suggesting that is one of the mindsets that needs to change when it comes to working with the First Nations, and the Inuit and the Métis communities who want to have power generation and some sovereignty in their, in their communities.
And just to build off what Daryl said, it's, a lot of times when you're looking at those northern projects, they're looking at that bottom line. They're looking at how much it costs. And I think that they shy away from doing what's right because it's too expensive to do what's right. But right now, we have to look at other ways and look at ways of reducing that barrier. There's got to be more cost-effective ways to do these projects up north without putting the project at risk. And I mean, it's for all our future. It's not just for the future of those communities. It's the future of our planet. So, I mean, if that comes with a higher price tag, well, let's pay that now instead of what's to come and what we don't know. So, that mindset that has to change. That what's resilient for us, like we talk about climate change resiliency. That definition for me is completely different than somebody in industry, because they're looking at it from a monetized perspective rather than a sustainability perspective and the way of life for our people.
Thank you so much, Tana. I think we have to close on that perfect wrap up that you just gave us of both of our panels today. So thank you. I just want to, end by saying a huge thank you to Tana, Daryl, and Chris for sharing your perspectives with us today. It's been really an honor to share this virtual stage with you. And I really encourage folks on the line to check out the Waves of Change scoping paper and also the work that ICE does. I know we got a bit of a sneak preview today, but encourage you to check out their website and also to stay tuned for the launch of the Institute's electricity report in May. So check out our report page and sign up for updates. And thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.